They said the fairy tale was already shattered, but nobody was ready for the moment the knives came out behind palace doors and the whispers turned into a full-blown royal detonation. Because this time, it wasn't about bruised egos, broken interviews, or who snubbed who at a balcony appearance. This time, the storm circled 2 children and a mother now being accused, in the coldest corridors of power, of walking away while the crown quietly stepped in. And the name echoing through marble hallways and voices sharp as shattered glass? Meghan Markle. By the time London woke up to the headlines, the decision had already been moving like a silent avalanche through royal channels. No dramatic press conference. No emotional plea, just sealed documents, emergency briefings, and senior royals summoned with a kind of urgency usually reserved for constitutional nightmares. Behind closed doors, the story being told was explosive, sudden school withdrawals, missed welfare communications, and what palace insiders were branding, with chilling precision, parental disengagement. And while California's sunshine bathed Montecito in golden calm, across the ocean the atmosphere was ice-cold and clinical. Meetings stacked on meetings, legal phrases flying like daggers. The children's names spoken not with affection, but with the gravity of state responsibility. Then came the red folder. You know the type, thick official, the kind that doesn't carry gossip, it carries consequences. It reportedly landed on a polished table with a thud that said everything words didn't have to. Inside? A paper trail that insiders claim painted a picture of distant silence and decisions that made senior royals go very, very still. And when the folder was opened, the temperature in the room changed. Because this wasn't framed as a messy divorce subplot. This was framed as a crisis of guardianship. A question of who, in the end, was actually showing up for 2 royal-born children whose lives were now being dissected by courts, advisors, and officials who don't blink when emotions get messy. One insider would later murmur, this stopped being about reputation. It became about responsibility. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the silence from Meghan's side only grew louder. No fiery statement, no tearful defense, just tight-lipped legal language and the kind of PR stillness that makes Hollywood nervous. Because in that town, silence doesn't read as dignity, it reads as damage control. And then came the move that made even seasoned royal watchers blink. Emergency custodial protocols. Not a phrase you hear in celebrity breakups, not a step taken lightly. But according to the narrative forming inside palace walls, the crown wasn't reacting to tabloid drama. It was activating mechanisms designed for situations where royal minors are considered at risk of instability or exploitation. The tone wasn't emotional, it was institutional. Cold. Final, passports, privacy shields, legal guardianship structures. Words that sound boring until you realize they redraw the map of a child's entire world. And hovering awkwardly in the background of all this? Prince Harry. Sources whispered he was stunned, blindsided, caught between loyalty to the woman he once blew up his life for and the children whose futures were now being negotiated in rooms he wasn't fully inside. His requests, we're told, ran into walls of protocol, paperwork, and questions about stability that made the situation even messier. Back in Britain, another figure quietly stepped forward, not with speeches, but with presence: Catherine, Princess of Wales. While one mother was being painted as absent, another was being positioned, carefully, symbolically, as steady, nurturing, available. Subtle photo releases. Carefully worded updates about emotional support and stability. No attacks, just contrast. The kind that doesn't need commentary because the imagery does the talking. And oh, the imagery. Children walking through Windsor grounds, familiar royal cousins nearby. An atmosphere of continuity, of heritage, of you belong here. It was soft power at its most surgical, not screaming, just showing. Meanwhile, in entertainment circles, the chill was spreading. Executives who once saw Meghan as ratings gold were suddenly wary of legal smoke they didn't want drifting into their boardrooms. Projects slowed. Calls went unanswered. The word floating around wasn't icon, it was liability. And through it all, one question throbbed like a bass line under the chaos. Why now? Why, just as legal pressure peaked, were there reports of branding pivots, solo ventures, and children's names being scrubbed from certain media strategies? To palace insiders, it looked like erasure. To her defenders, it might have looked like protection. But in the brutal court of public perception, nuance rarely wins. Inside royal briefings, the interpretation was harsher, that distance from the institution had slowly become distance from co-parenting structures, and that eventually, someone in authority decided distance had crossed into abandonment. And once that word enters the room, everything changes. Because now it's not gossip, it's guardianship. Now it's not about who hurt whose feelings. It's about who signs school forms, who attends medical reviews, who answers when officials call. Unsexy details that suddenly carry the weight of a monarchy's future narrative. As night fell over London, the decisions hardened. Legal language locked in, protocols activated that hadn't been touched in generations. The crown, that ancient machine, moving not with drama, but with inevitability. And somewhere between California palm trees and Windsor stone walls, a family fracture turned into a constitutional storyline, with 2 children at the center, a father caught in the middle, and a mother now watching as the institution she once tried to escape quietly reaches back in. The world is waiting to hear her side. But the palace? The palace has already made its move. By the second sunrise, the story had stopped being a scandal and started feeling like a siege, not with soldiers, but with paperwork, protocol, and a monarchy that knows exactly how to play the long game. Because while the public waited for a tearful counterattack or a fiery interview teaser, what actually rolled out was something far more unnerving: quiet, coordinated containment. Behind palace walls, advisors weren't debating feelings. They were mapping futures, schooling routes, emotional support frameworks, long-term identity shielding, the kind of planning that says, without ever saying it out loud, we're preparing for this to last. And in Montecito, the mood was reportedly very different. Phones lighting up, agents asking careful questions. Lawyers using words like jurisdictional complexity and narrative exposure. Because when a royal institution starts framing events in terms of child welfare and structural guardianship, that's not tabloid drama anymore. That's a reputational earthquake that can swallow brand deals whole. One entertainment insider allegedly whispered that executives weren't worried about public backlash. They were worried about legal entanglements. No one wants to bankroll a project that might end up referenced in custody filings or international disputes. Suddenly, meetings that once felt glamorous started feeling radioactive. At the same time, back in Britain, another layer of symbolism slid into place. Prince William, usually careful and controlled, was said to be unusually direct in private briefings. Not emotional, not explosive, just firm in a way that reportedly left no room for debate. The framing, insiders claim, was simple. This was about stability, continuity, and preventing 2 young lives from becoming tug-of-war trophies in a transatlantic brand war. And standing beside him in this tightening circle of authority? Princess Anne, the royal family's famously no-nonsense operator. If William was the future voice of the crown, Anne was the steel spine of its present. Sources suggest she pushed hard for decisive action, arguing that delay would only deepen uncertainty around the children. The optics were impossible to ignore. While California represented reinvention and personal freedom, Windsor projected permanence, stone walls, history, lineage. The message didn't need narration. One side looked fluid and modern, the other looked immovable and eternal. And right in the middle of that visual contrast were 2 children whose names were now being spoken, less like celebrity offspring and more like constitutional footnotes. Meanwhile, speculation about Meghan's next move grew louder by the hour. Would she speak? Would she fight? Would she frame this as institutional overreach, maternal silencing, or something even bigger? Supporters online argued she was being frozen out. Critics claimed the institution was stepping in because it felt forced to. The truth? Buried under strategy, emotion, and a mountain of sealed filings. What made everything feel even more combustible was the timing. Reports swirled that new solo ventures were in development, projects centered on independence, resilience, personal rebirth. But to palace watchers, the overlap between branding pivots and escalating custodial tensions looks suspiciously like 2 completely different battles being fought on the same calendar. And then there was Harry, always the emotional wildcard, now reportedly isolated, stretched thin, and painfully aware that every move he made would be interpreted as choosing a side, his wife, or the system that raised him. Insiders described him as desperate to maintain connection with his children while navigating a legal and diplomatic maze that made even small requests complicated. The tragedy in his position wasn't loud, it was quiet. A man who once walked away from the institution, now watching that same institution step toward his children with legal authority he no longer fully shared. That's not a tabloid twist. That's Shakespeare with Wi-Fi. Public reaction split straight down emotional lines. Some saw a mother being cornered by a centuries-old machine protecting its image. Others saw a monarchy stepping in because it believed parental structures had broken down. And because official records were sealed and statements were carefully worded, the vacuum filled with theories, outrage, and viral certainty on both extremes. But inside the palace narrative, one theme reportedly dominated: continuity. Continuity of education, continuity of environment, continuity of identity. The fear, according to insiders, wasn't scandal, it was fragmentation. That the children's sense of who they were might get lost between branding, borders, and battles of narrative control. So the Crown did what it has always done in moments of perceived instability. It closed ranks. It built legal walls. It replaced emotional language with procedural language. Because procedures don't cry, don't argue on television, don't trend for the wrong reasons. Procedures just endure. And Meghan? She remained the great unanswered question. Was she strategizing in silence, waiting for the right platform? Was she blindsided and regrouping? Or was she choosing privacy in a moment when any word could be weaponized? No one outside her inner circle truly knew, and that mystery only made the narrative around her more volatile. What is certain is that the fairy tale chapter of this saga is long gone. What's left is something raw: power versus autonomy, institution versus individual, heritage versus reinvention. And at the center of it all, two young lives now wrapped in legal language, emotional speculation, and a battle over who gets to define their future. The palace has made its stance clear through action, not speeches. Now the world waits to see whether Meghan answers with a roar, or with a silence even louder than the Crown's.